Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and at CES this year we saw a bunch of these replica controllers from Retrobit, and now they are finally out. This one is a Sega Genesis controller that looks almost identical to the original. They certainly nailed the packaging, and this one certainly looks pretty close to what you might remember playing with back then. It supports the PC, the Mac, and the Nintendo Switch, but I also found it works with Android devices, and it should also work successfully with Raspberry Pis as well. So there's some pretty decent compatibility with this, yet you've got a very familiar look and feel. This is the USB version that we're looking at today, but they also have one that plugs into the Sega Genesis console and anything else that supports that Sega Genesis controller. Lots of cool stuff here. So we're going to dive into the USB version here in just a second, but I do want to let you know, in the interest of full disclosure, that I paid for this with my own funds. All the opinions you're about to hear are my own. Nobody is paying for this review, nor has anyone reviewed or approved what you're about to see before it was uploaded. So let's get into it now and see what this controller is all about. So let's take a closer look now at the hardware. It really does a nice job here mimicking the look and feel of the original Sega 6-button controller. In fact, I believe this controller also works with the Sega Genesis Mini that is on the way out to the marketplace, which does not, by the way, come with a 6-button controller, so this is your option for that. Now here is the original 6-button. My controller here is well over 20 years old, and it really lines up quite nicely with it, as you can see. The buttons feel very similar. Even the travel on the buttons feels the same. It really has just a very familiar feel to it, to the point where I think your muscle memory will certainly take over, and you might see some better performance in some of the games you're playing. The D-pad on my old controller here I think is a bit worn out, but it does feel like the Retrobit controller has a little more travel to the directional pad. That's the only real difference that I felt here, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm getting a good amount of tactile feel on it. I found as I was playing the games that it's pretty accurate and precise, and I was quite pleased with just how well the controller is performing here. And it's not that expensive either. It's only $20. So you can get a bunch of these and have some couch co-op play, or just do some other games like fighting games or whatever on your computer or other device running some of your favorite retro titles there. The cable here is USB. Let me find the other end of it. The cable length is about 10 feet. That's about 3 meters. And you've got your standard USB connector here on the end of the cable. You can, of course, use an adapter to get it to work with USB-C devices. It does support X input and direct input, so it has pretty broad compatibility for anything that supports either one of those two controller modes. You switch modes by hitting Start and B while the controller is plugged in. Now, it does not retain any settings between sessions, and it defaults to direct input. So if you switch it to X input and then disconnect it, you'll have to switch back over to X input the next time you plug it in. The big difference here on this controller versus the old one is that you have a left and right shoulder button now, which was not on the original controller, and they moved the mode button down here to the bottom, or the middle, I should say, so that you can make room for those two buttons up there. But otherwise, it really feels pretty close to the original, and I'm quite pleased with that overall look and feel. Let's plug it into my PC now and see how they map all these buttons out. All right, so here is the default X input mappings here for the controller. So right now, the D-pad here is mapped to the left thumbstick. Your two shoulder buttons here are working where you would expect them to work. The start menu is start, the mode menu is back, and then you have your diamond of buttons here on the Xbox controller mapped to these four here. So this might feel a little different to you depending on the games that you're playing, but a lot of older Sega titles, of course, will map out really nicely with this. And then what they did is they mapped Z and C to the left and right triggers. Now again, these are not analog, so they're either on or off, so I do anticipate you'll be doing some custom button mapping in your favorite games or platforms like Steam to get everything working exactly the way you want. Now I would suggest not losing the instruction sheet that comes with the controller, because there are, first of all, some guides to different button mappings. And what was interesting is they didn't indicate PS3 support in the box, but they do have it listed here. I don't have a PS3 to test it on, but some other folks in the comments may want to mention whether or not they've had success with that. And then you'll see here there's also something called switch macros, and this does not pertain to the Nintendo Switch, but rather different ways for the controller to send out its directional pad input, and in one case change the button layout. So if I hit up and start, we can shift the controller's input from mapping to the left thumbstick to the directional pad. So we're going to do that right now. Hold down Start and Up. You got to hold it for 5 seconds, and you'll see the Start menu turn off, or the Start button turn off when that fires off there. And now you can see that the D-pad is mapping to the D-pad. And I believe this works in all modes. So if you're on a Nintendo Switch game, for example, that doesn't allow you to map things very easily, you can just remap the controller here. When you're done, you hold down Start and Left, and that will put it back to what it had at default. And then you can also map the D-pad to the right stick if you wanted to by holding down Right and Start, which I'll do right now. And once this executes, we can then see that our right stick now is mapped to the D-pad. And you're also able to swap A and B with X and Y if you're finding things aren't mapping out where you want them to be. Now, part of the reason why I wanted to get the controller was to use it with my Mister, which is a great open source project that recreates a lot of consoles and computers through the use of a field programmable gate array processor, or FPGA. It makes for very accurate recreations of this original hardware, and the 6-button controller here is working just fine with it. Now on the Mister, I did have to switch the controller into X input mode, and I have to do that every time I turn on the Mister because it doesn't retain settings again between sessions. But once I did that, I was able to map the buttons out to all the right buttons on the Genesis side of things and play Street Fighter II here, just like I remembered playing before. The directional pad feels great. All the directions work as you would expect. No errant issues that I could see with it. Everything just seemed to flow exactly the way I would expect it to. And I think Retrobit's done a nice job here with this controller, and playing games like Street Fighter II really feel close to the original experience I had 20-something years ago. It also worked fine with my Nvidia Shield TV, which is an Android device. It worked right out of the gate with that because it starts off in direct input mode. The Shield also supports X input, so you can pick the right mode for your particular use case, but either way, it looks like it was a good experience with Android. It also works with the Nintendo Switch, and I plugged it in with a USB-C adapter into the handheld as I was playing around with things, and that worked fine as well. Not all the Switch games, though, support button mapping, so you might run into some issues with buttons not being where you want them to be, again, given that the layout of the controller here is so different than what we see on typical retro controllers on modern hardware, so bear that in mind. We also did some latency tests a little bit earlier. So we were able to see how long it takes for a button push from the controller to register on screen. Now my methodology for this is I shoot a screen at 240 frames per second and see how long it takes for that button push to register. This is done on my gaming monitor over there. It's a 144 hertz monitor. And this is what that monitor is doing. You might have a faster monitor and you might see better results there, but because I tested on the same monitor with every controller I look at, we can see the variances between them. So I got a score on this one of 44 milliseconds, which is right up there with my Xbox One controller and all the other good USB controllers that we have looked at over the last 2 years or so. So from a latency standpoint, on USB, it is going to be just fine. On the Nintendo Switch, we were getting between 64 and 68 milliseconds, again, wired in directly to the console and using its screen. We found that the Pro controller, the wireless Pro controller, gets about that much when it's in wireless mode. So there's a bit of a latency hit on the Nintendo Switch, but I think if you're plugged into a TV with better response rates perhaps than the internal Switch display, you might do a little bit better, but it's performing no worse than anything else we've plugged into that device, including Nintendo's first-party controllers. So I think altogether it's going to be a good experience no matter what you plug it into. You can't beat the form factor here. It really captures that look and feel of the original Sega controller quite well, and I've been quite pleased playing around with it. Good compatibility here, and really nothing to complain about for its very reasonable $20 price tag. Until next time, this is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters, the Four Guys with Quarters podcast, Chris Allegretta, Tom Albrecht, Mike Talbert, Brian Parker, and Kalyan Kumar. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to Lon.TV/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit Lon.TV/s.